Okay, Jesse, you and I had a discussion on morality, and I don't recall everything we discussed, but I remember we disagreed.
We did.
Shall we pick up on that?
Sure, why not?
Okay. So I believe that there's no real need for the concept of morality, since I believe morality can be traced all the way back to emotions, and that's all there is.
See, I think while at a pure level I admit it is difficult to justify, I think if we can start with a set of basic assumptions about what's right and wrong, which seem fairly universal, then from that we can rationally deduce what's right and wrong in a very practical sense and apply it in the world.
But aren't those fundamental, those axiomatic assumptions based on emotions, those starters, so to speak?
Yes, in our discussion I conceded that they were,
okay.
But I don't really see the significance of that, in that it is an emotional belief. To me it's emotional belief that it's wrong to, say, kill another human being, or a non-human for that matter, non-human animal for that matter, but that doesn't mean that I can't apply that to determine the morality or otherwise of certain actions.
You can apply the morality of certain actions based on the emotional assumptions you started with, but doesn't that make your conclusion emotional? Input, output?
Yes. Does that matter?
It matters to what the conception of morality is. If morality, I want to be able to say morality at its basic core is emotional, and many people can't admit to that.
And in our discussion, I think that's sort of about where we got down to, that it is, although in the same discussion, if I remember right, and I hope I'm quoting you right here, you basically said that everything boils down to emotions, that emotions are really the only real thing in the world. And I think your case for that is quite strong. But if I bring that back to morality, surely that makes morality just as important or just a real discipline as, say, science?
I want to suggest that there's no legitimate need to use the word morality. It's all emotional. We can set up a system of behavior for ourselves based on our emotions, but that doesn't make it any less emotional.
Yes, but I think I prefer to use the word ethics than morality, but it's...
Okay.
But it's
there we go. We can both agree to that.
Okay.
That's a more palatable word. Based on our beliefs, I think.
Right, we can agree on that one, okay. I see the process as being... Oh, sorry, can you repeat your previous point?
I can't remember, I'm an old man.
So I see the reasoning process in determining whether or not something is ethical or not as very similar to the reasoning process of science. In that science, arguably, you could say, starts with emotional beliefs, does it? Does science start with emotional beliefs?
No.
How about the...
Well, yes and no. It's like when you plug a computer in, every computer needs an electrical source, right?
Yeah.
But when the computer makes calculations, the calculations themselves do not depend on what type of wattage or amplitude is supplied in the power source. The calculations of the computer are independent of the power source, right?
Yes.
So science needs some type of motivation for people to be inquisitive, but that does not mean that the conclusions of science need to be emotional. There can be an initial emotional commitment to finding what is true.
Okay, can I not then apply that same logic to ethics, where you say there has to be an emotional commitment on my part that, say, to inflict unnecessary suffering on another sentient being is morally wrong? But then I can go on.
In science, there's objective truth. In what you just said, there's not objective truth. There is only an emotional foundation of the idea that you should not inflict suffering on other people.
Okay, but I can still use a process of reasoning, if you like, what was going on in the computer to work out whether or not it's, say, a good thing to buy products made in sweatshops in China, or to do any number of other actions which have consequences on the world. I may be basing the reasoning on emotionally based.
If I have an emotional desire to eat ice cream, and I decide the best way to accomplish that by maybe mowing the yard and getting some money, then walking to the ice cream shop, I'm employing rationality. But at base, at its very foundation, it's emotional.
Yes, but if you believe that theft is wrong, also taking someone else's property with undue cause is wrong.
I believe that's just emotional. I don't like that. I don't like it when people steal my things.
Okay, why do you assume then that it's wrong to steal somebody else's thing?
I don't assume it's wrong. I don't use the word wrong.
Yeah, okay, well pointed, well noted. Okay, I still don't see why the process of reasoning isn't relevant in the world, given that the consequences of what we do, what we eat and what we wear and where we go, and how we act are so significant for others in the world.
Just because something employs reason does not mean it is not based on emotions. As my illustration about getting ice cream pointed out. So
okay,
maybe I should think about a better example.
Could you bring an example which does at least according to someone have moral implications? So there are probably
no. I can't. I don't believe in morality.
Okay. At least one you would acknowledge that somebody else would. Okay. How about do you? I know we talked about this in the discussion, but do you have any moral objection to? No. Do you have any emotional objection to slavery?
No, I don't believe in morality. Something's not moral or immoral. It's all amoral. There's no such thing as morality.
Okay.
So it's asking whether or not slavery is moral or immoral is an invalid question. There's no domain of morality in which we can answer that question.
Okay. Hang on, there's no... Okay, if you lived in a country, let's say in the US, slavery still existed, and you lived there,
right,
would you feel compelled for any reason, emotional or otherwise, to...
Emotional.
Okay, so you'd feel emotional compulsion to do something to stop it?
Correct.
Would you act on it?
If the emotion was strong enough, yes.
What would you do?
It depends on the context. I don't know who I would be in that context. I mean, I might have a family I'd be worried about. If I were to do something and that action were to have consequences that might affect my family, then I'd have to take that emotion into consideration also.
Let's see. Okay, let me bring a more practical. Let me bring another case in. Say, for example, someone stormed the neighbour's place and held them up, or they physically threatened them in a way you thought they were unsafe. Would you feel compelled to do anything about it?
I would not feel compelled, but I wouldn't feel morally compelled because I don't believe in morality. I might feel emotionally compelled. In fact, I'm more the type of person who intervenes if I see someone else harmed.
Okay, and why do you do that?
Because it bothers me emotionally to see somebody suffer.
Okay. Does it bother you that there are a lot of people in the world living really, I guess, in unfortunate circumstances in the world, living in poverty, basically?
It does.
Do you feel compelled to do anything about it?
Yes.
Why?
Well, because I don't like to see that. But doing something about that might mean allowing. This sounds bad. It might mean allowing some people to die.
Can you explain that one more?
Yes. If you allow people to continue to overpopulate beyond the resources available, then you're going to have more suffering in the world a generation later.
Okay, and why you mentioned the suffering there? What you said suggested that you're reasoning in order to minimise the suffering in the world. Is that what you were thinking there?
Yes.
Why do you have an emotional objection to? No, let me rephrase that. You seem to have an emotional objection to unnecessary suffering.
I have an emotional objection to that, yes.
And I share that, and I think most people, for whatever reason, share that objection. Perhaps not everyone, but most people. And it seems that you would reason, or you have reason, to figure ways to minimise the suffering in the world, albeit only to appease your emotional discontent with it.
That's right.
I describe that reasoning process as ethics. The process of reasoning through so that we can reduce the suffering in the world.
The problem is, people say this is moral, this is immoral, and they use words such as ought or you should do this. When that ought and that should have no other power than emotions.
So you're saying basically,
rather than saying I don't like it when you do this, we're saying you should do this, and thinking the use of should gives it greater strength.
So basically, you're happy to say I'm not happy. Say, quote, for you, speaking for you here, I don't like the suffering in the world. Therefore, I'm compelled to do something about it. Therefore, I will do something about it, or at least will suggest reasons. But you're not going to say that I should do something. I, or you for that matter, or anyone should do something about it.
That's right.
You choose to, because so if I'm not emotionally compelled to do something about the suffering in the world,
that's right.
I'm under no obligation to do that.
There's no moral obligation. They're only emotions. And if your emotions don't match mine, there's going to be a problem.
So if I see someone come in here with a gun and start killing people, and I have the means to trip him up as he comes through the door there,
right?
I'm under no moral obligation to do so.
You're not.
I'm under any sort of obligation to do so.
There's no such thing as moral obligation.
Any other sort of obligation, society?
I can't think of any obligation that would be less than moral. Obligation implies something moral.
So there's no obligation to do anything in the world other than, there's no obligation to do anything whatsoever.
No.
And we choose to do things because our emotions compel us to.
That's right. We can create principles for ourselves that we follow, but those are generated from our emotions, and those are only guidelines to try to maximize whatever our emotional goals are.
Okay. That case is very difficult to argue for. I can see that once we establish a common ground of ethics, it's very easy to debate the pros or rights or wrongs of a particular thing. It's very difficult to argue the absolute existence of morality or ethics. I'll concede that. But can I ask, go on.
Let me introduce a famous thought experiment, the one where you're able to stop a speeding train containing 100 passengers by pushing a fat man onto the tracks.
I covered this with my philosophy class.
Would you do it?
It's funny that I hesitate after going over that with the class. I would probably not do it.
Okay.
Although I would probably say that I should.
I just probably say, right now, I might. But I'm not there. But once I reach that situation, I simply act on my emotions.
Okay. See, one thing I established very early in my philosophy class, and it was that we were talking ethics, and when we studied ethics, and distinguished the difference between ethics and psychology. So we looked at the case of a similar moral dilemma. I'm sure you've used it. Of say half a dozen people being trapped down a mine, and there's only enough oxygen for 4 of them to survive, or 5 of them to survive.
Right.
Should they kill the weakest or the oldest, or should they kill one of the people so they can all survive? And we established a difference between what we should do and what we would do. You're basically reducing it all to psychology, the study of what we would do.
Yeah, but wouldn't mind being the one to die either. So in that sense, I think I'm pretty emotionally altruistic. I'm selfish too, but I don't mind dying for somebody else.
But you're not going to say that you should do it, so you don't mind. You're emotionally comfortable with it, even though, of course, your death will bring the end of your emotional being.
Exactly.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, no problem. Well, I've had a good life, so if I were to die and to give other people a longer life, more chances for satisfaction, go for it, because I've had a very satisfying life.
Makes sense. So you're saying that you would jump, but you wouldn't say that I or you or anyone else should jump?
No, we don't
as
need
an
to. There's
alternative
no
question, if
obligation.
that matters. Interesting. It's very hard to argue with that point. Can I come back just you? Will you agree that there are certain things? What's the better word? Certain occurrences, I guess,
Okay.
which majority of people, which we seem to have an almost universal emotional objection to.
Now, yes.
Why do you think that is?
Well, let's take cannibalism, for example. We have a distaste for eating something that looks similar to ourselves, but I can't think of a single moral reason why we should not cannibalize others if our survival is in question.
See, I would explain that evolutionary. So I would explain it in terms of evolution. I would just say that
most people would say it's immoral to cannibal. Well, when we say cannibalize, we're talking about just eating a dead body, not killing somebody.
Oh, I thought you were talking about actually hunting them down, hunting and killing them. Oh, you're just talking about eating the body itself,
the flesh of someone who has already died naturally.
As in the plane crash where they had to eat in the Andes, whatever it was called.
Right.
I have no ethical objection to that.
Okay,
In
but
fact,
many people would.
That's true. I would say, and this is where I like to distinguish ethics from morality, I would say that people usually based on religious beliefs may have a moral objection. This is where I'll distinguish them, but I would say
so you do believe morality is connected intrinsically to religion?
The definitions are vague, but I would associate morality with religion and perhaps society, and ethics as being more of a rational pursuit, more akin to science,
Okay.
admittedly based on emotional foundations.
I think those definitions are inherently very, very soft, and I question their utility.
Go on, question them, or challenge them. If
I
morality...
just think that, I think that to keep things simple, you just stick to emotions. Rather than pretending there's some greater force to being able to say you should do this, you ought not to do that.
Oh, I'm not saying there's some greater force, although I think at some deep level I suppose I do believe it's right to do this or wrong to do that. But
Then
my
ethically,
point,
this take the concept of ethics then, after you arrive upon an ethical conclusion, what kind of word do you use? Do you use you should do something or you ought to do something? What kind of words do you use for an ethical conclusion?
I'd be inclined to use should or ought. Yeah.
That for me that has a strength, a power that is illegitimate when it's just emotion.
Okay,
emotions at the base.
But what if the base is something everyone I'm using it in the context agrees with? So if you don't agree that inequality is a bad thing, perhaps I shouldn't say you ought not do this. But if we can establish common ground, then why can't I use ought?
Because people who are moralist or ethicist will say that even if the majority of people believe in slavery, it's still wrong. So you're internally inconsistent.
As I say, that's where it comes down to I have an inherent belief that equality is good and therefore that slavery is wrong. But that one I concede I can't justify.
Okay.
I see that, but I don't really think that matters. I see the process as being the evolution of society to a better state, and ethics as being what at least measures and guides that.
A better state. What might that be?
Okay. If you could live 200 years ago, or you could live now, aside from technology, when would you live?
Well, let me ask a more fundamental question. Why limit it to the human race?
I don't.
Right now, other species. Okay.
Oh, do you mean as moral agents, as they say, or as I take the suffering or other pleasure or suffering of all sentient beings into account?
Okay, then why should humans survive?
What's that?
Why should humans survive? What makes the perpetuation of the human race a good thing?
I wouldn't necessarily have said it was.
Okay.
I would say if we go back, say, a few hundred years where women were basically enslaved, stuck at home, black Americans, whatever you want to say, were literally slaves. I see society as being better, and I would say that's ethical or moral progress.
To what? What's the goal? You make it teleological, but what is the end goal? What is the objective there?
I don't know, but I can see progress. And again, I would liken it to science there. We don't really know. Science's ultimate goal, I suppose, is to...
In order to see progress, you have to have a goal.
Okay. I suppose, then I hadn't thought about it, I suppose the goal is equality, maximum happiness and pleasure, minimum... I'm being very utilitarian here.
You are.
It's easier to argue. Maximised pleasure and happiness for all sentient beings and minimal pain and suffering. I think that's a reasonable endpoint. Mm-hmm. And equality.
Okay.
And
have we concluded anything?
I suppose I'd like to ask you,
okay.
Do you see any inherent advantage or anything better in society as it is now than it was a few hundred years ago, barring technological progress?
Well, if you define better as less violent, I think that Steven Pinker made a good point in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, that the world is becoming more and more peaceful and less violent. There is more equality in the world. I think there is more pleasure among humans, anyway. So yeah, I think the world is becoming better, if better is attached to the goal of more pleasure. I do agree with that.
Do you think that's a reasonable better, or do you think there is no better?
I think that there is a better if...
And what is that? Yeah, what is that better?
More pleasure.
Okay.
Less pain, more pleasure. Yeah, less pain, more pleasure.
And so if I could say that doing a certain thing would increase the pleasure or decrease the pain and suffering in the world, would that be more satisfying to you?
Yeah, that's rational, but it's not moral. Okay, rationality is doing things that accomplish your emotional goals. But there's no morality necessary there.
Okay, so we can agree that, for us at least, and I suspect for the vast majority of the human population, that an increase in pleasure and happiness and a decrease in pain and suffering is a good thing.
For most humans, that's true. Yeah. However, for psychopaths, for example, there's still no moral obligation. There's no immorality for psychopaths. There's only a difference, an emotional difference between the average human and them. So my emotions are going to cause me to try to limit the negative actions of psychopaths, but I still can't pass moral judgment on them and say they're immoral.
If you had the choice, would you lock them up?
Yeah, but I have no problem with killing psychopaths either.
Okay. On what grounds would you lock them up or kill them?
If I thought the greater good, the greatest amount of pleasure would be accomplished by locking them or killing them.
So you acknowledge the importance of reasoning about what we should do in order to maximise the greater good, if you like, the pleasure or whatever.
I strongly believe that we should be rational
about
everything we do.
Okay.
If you have a goal, for any goals we have, rationality is important to best accomplish those goals.
I completely agree. We agree on that one. But I actually don't think we're that far from agreeing here, because it seems that we both agree that we should apply reason to work out how the world can, say, have more pleasure and less pain and suffering.
We both believe in rationality, yes.
As applied to that end.
Yes, but I still don't understand where morality comes
from. Okay,
as part of that.
I call that process the process of ethics, and it's important to me.
But ethics, for most people, means you should or should not do something, you ought or not ought.
Okay,
or ought not do
I should do something which will maximise the amount of happiness or pleasure in the world, or reduce the amount of pain and suffering.
But most people abbreviate that into this you should do, this you shouldn't do, without indexing or even considering the goals.
But as long as I'm fairly set and fairly established on my goals, that doesn't matter. I mean, I could say, no, I shouldn't go and kill someone because it would minimise the pain and suffering, but is it really necessary? Isn't it easy just to say I shouldn't kill someone?
I'm against using words in society that are not properly understood by society. So if you're using the word should in a utilitarian fashion, while the people you're speaking to understand it in a moral fashion, I think it's not communicating.
But I do mean it in the moral sense, the morality, or as I say, the ethics being based on the fact that doing so will be good for the greater good.
That's not how the people you're speaking to take it.
How do they take it?
They take it like there's moral absolutes in the world.
Okay, so what we've come to, fair point, so essentially we've come down to semantics as to whether or not the process...
I agree. You can use the term morality if you mean the same thing I mean, in that a rational process whereby you take action, a rational action, to accomplish your emotional goals. You could call that morality because words have no significance outside. Words are defined conventionally. My contention is that using the word morality and using the word ethics at this point in the English-speaking world does not have the same definition you're applying to it. You're stipulating that ethics means is something utilitarian, when most people in the world, when they hear the word should or hear the word ought, think about absolute morality.
I see what you mean, and that is, while I'm not entirely utilitarian, that is one big appeal of utilitarianism, is that it gives it something to weigh up on, and it gives it something to measure, and that's why I find it so interesting.
Okay. So, for example, I know what people mean, I know what scientists mean when they use the word knowledge. I use the word I know, for example, when I'm speaking to the ordinary people, but I would never use the word knowledge when I'm talking to a philosopher about an epistemological topic.
See, I would avoid using this, changing the topic, I would avoid using the word know, I suppose, unless it's in any philosophical or any point of contention. Because I don't
when
like
I'm talking to my friends or family, I say, I know.
I know what time I'm going to arrive tomorrow is fine, or I know what time the train gets in, but I don't know the best solution to this, or the best way to teach that, or the best whatever, because if it's a contentious point, chances are I don't know.
So, if you're going to use a word properly, you're going to try to... you should try, in my opinion, you should... Whoops, I used the word should.
Yeah, based on what?
In my opinion, words are only useful if they have the same meaning on both sides of the conversation. And I think the word moral often does not, because, for example, you're thinking about morality in a utilitarian way, when your audience, for most people in the world, they believe morality is something related to some higher power handing mankind a moral standard.
See, I'm not sure that, I don't think that, and it may be different audiences or who we see as our target being, but I use a practical example, like I'm very opposed to factory farming because of the suffering it inflicts on hens. And I will, if explaining that as I used to do, say on stalls on the street, I would always start with a picture of a battery hen and say this is the suffering. So I would say it's rather inherent in my approach, in my whole message, that I'm basically saying they'll use the should. You shouldn't buy battery hen eggs because it essentially inflicts this suffering on this hen. Mm-hmm. So I would say that I'm not saying it's handed out by some higher power. I'm saying you shouldn't because of the suffering here. I don't see...
I believe you can, you should, if you have the goal, and if you introduce the goal. So to eliminate suffering, you need to avoid eating meat.
Okay, sure. But when I show people the image of the hen in the cage, I would take it as a given that we agree on the fact that that's not a good thing. And then I'm simply introducing the idea that by buying eggs at the supermarket, the person is contributing to that.
Yes, but there is a tendency among people who employ moral arguments to try to give the conclusion a stronger weight than just the fact that we have the same emotional foundation for this decision. for this
I would
conclusion?
say, I mean, again, I have to admit, I'm not going to say admit, I don't see anything wrong with it, but I'd have to say that I do feel an absolute, there is something wrong with inflicting that suffering on a hen so that we can get a cheap egg.
You said an absolute wrong?
I'm going to say an absolute wrong, but I acknowledge that I can't justify that. In the same way that scientifically, I have an absolute, a belief that the world works according to natural laws, but I can't absolutely prove that. As in, the fundamental assumption of science is that the entire universe works according to a set of laws which we have to uncover.
Then we
it
do
isn't
believe
possible to prove
differently.
that.
Then we do have a fundamental difference in our beliefs. I don't see where this absolute wrong can come from.
And we do, yes. But I acknowledge, as I say, that that's just an inherent belief that I can't justify.
Okay.
But I think most people would agree with that, and that's why I say the process of reasoning and discussion of ethics is important.
Most people would agree that you should believe something that has no foundation?
No, most people inherently feel that sense of that some things are right and some things are wrong, so it's important to reason our way so that we can come to agree on it.
I don't think the rational mind should believe anything that has no justification.
Why, okay, if I can compare it to the science then, why do you believe the world, presumably, the world works according to a set of unchanging laws?
Because in my immediate perception, I've seen the world works, continues to work in a particular fashion.
Fair enough.
Inductively, the world, as far as I've experienced it, has worked a particular way. The sun comes up every day. I'm inclined to believe it's going to come up tomorrow. I don't have an absolute belief in that, but I have a justified belief in that. I have a rational belief in that, based on the principle of induction.
Makes sense. As I say, I probably a tangent there to science, but as I say, the belief that there is an absolute sense of right and wrong is an inherent one which can't be justified. I can see that.
Induction doesn't lend itself to that.
No, it doesn't. But I don't really see the significance of the fact, as I say, I can't prove that there is absolute morality. But I don't really see why that's important that's why I like utilitarianism. The belief in absolute morality doesn't matter, so long as we agree on some basic assumptions about what's good and bad. Shall we sort of summarise it?
All right. So what can we say at this point about our differing beliefs?
It seems to me that I have a fundamental belief that certain things are right and wrong. I can't justify the existence of morality, but we can agree on common assumptions of what's right, of what's good and bad, certain things we like or dislike, and apply reason to bring about those ends.
And I believe that the terms good and bad can't be used in isolation. You have to index some type of emotion initially to make things good or bad.
Okay, I'd agree with that. But I'd agree with that in terms of our perceptions. But if we agree on those things, I don't see that it matters. So if we agree that increasing the suffering in the world is bad, whether or not I believe it absolutely doesn't matter. We can still reason our way to reduce the suffering in the world. And that's the process of ethics to me.
For me, increasing suffering in the world is bad because I dislike suffering for myself and others. And that's all I can say about it.
But do you see it as important to reduce the suffering in the world, if only to appease your emotional...
Yes, but our agreement is just like theists and non-theists agreeing that marriage is important, when the theists believe that marriage is something sanctioned by God, and non-theists believing that marriage is something that has utility for society.
I see what you mean, okay.
They agree, however, their agreement is based on wholly different assumptions.
And, okay, that causes conflict and issues. The issue of marriage, particularly obviously gay marriage, causes conflict. I don't really see my absolute belief in morality and your lack of is any reason for conflict?
Not behavioral conflict. I think we can take the same actions, just like people, theists who believe marriage comes from God and non-theists who believe marriage comes from society can both be married. So, but I'd like to get at the foundation of what morality and ethics is, and if it's a legitimate concept. I'm still claiming it's not.
And as I say, that one is basically impossible to argue with. And it's impossible to prove the existence of morality.
Okay, let's agree to study it more.
So agree to what?
Study it more.
Okay.
So we'll agree to study it more and see where we are a year from now. Let's check back with each other, okay?
Sounds good.
Okay.
That was very interesting. Thank you. I just lost my train of thought.